We've got just about 57 minutes left in trade. We're going to switch gears here for a hot second. With shipping and logistics playing an imperative role in the supply chain, 2021 saw the launch of a trucking action plan in combined effort from the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Labor. The industry directly grapples with higher fuel prices amid persistent efforts to grow employment in trucking. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg joined President Biden on the South Lawn for today's remarks, and here's what he had to say.
In fact, there's nothing new about how much America counts on truckers, but it has become more urgent than ever. Right now, the industry estimates that we're short 80,000 truck drivers. And my department estimates that 300,000 leave the career every year. So we must do more and do better to recruit more people into the job and to support them so they choose to stay in the job.
And Transportation Secretary Buttigieg joins us now. Thank you so much for taking the time here today, Secretary. One of the most pressing matters for the industry, higher fuel prices, which can negatively impact freight companies' expenses and more directly hit earnings for owner-operated truckers and their earnings. So beyond a release of oil reserves, what additional measures is the White House putting on the table to counter these headwinds to the industry earnings?
Well, look, all options are going to remain on the table, and the release of strategic petroleum reserve barrels is obviously a very big one, in addition to actions that have coordinated with partners and allies around the world to try to stabilize that price of oil. Of course, we know that the price of gas and diesel is based on the price of oil, and that's set globally. But steps like this make a difference, even as we're working to take action that for the long run will cushion American drivers, families and professional drivers, from some of those ups and downs of world petroleum markets. We're also insisting that we take a closer look at how these prices flow through in our economy. It seems like when oil prices go up, gas prices go up in a lockstep, but somehow when oil prices resettle back down, the reverse is not true. We need to ask whether, frankly, the industry is doing everything it can to make sure that Americans, drivers, consumers are protected at a time when we need all of us to be doing what we can to help address this issue that affects the whole economy and affects every American.
And to that point, Yahoo Finance spoke to owner-operator trucker Michael Whitaker, and he said that with these diesel costs so high, he says, quote, "I think we're going to have a lot of bankruptcies of individual drivers and trucking companies. Given the amount of goods that travel by road in the U.S. and how dependent we are, what's the administration's plan to really help them? And what message do you have for some of these drivers?"
Well, first of all, that we're doing everything we can to support drivers, both in terms of the bottom line and in terms of working conditions. Look, one thing that affects the bottom line of a lot of drivers, including owner-operators, is the loss of time, and time equals money when they're waiting to pick up a load. Sometimes out of the 11 hours that you're permitted to drive, you've got about 4.5 then alongside that you're not being compensated because your load isn't moving, because you're waiting at a port gate or a warehouse somewhere. And frankly, nobody pays for that except the driver themselves. We've got to look at that, and that's one of the compensation study items that we're taking up right now with the Department of Labor. We're looking at some of the reasons why the typical compensation for a driver is down almost a third in real dollars from what it was in the 1970s. When you have those kinds of trends, then that means there's much less cushion, much less margin to deal with the ups and downs that are happening in the gas and diesel pricing. There have always been those ups and downs, but there has not always been this kind of squeeze on drivers because of those other conditions. We can do something about that. We have as much, or frankly much more, control over that than we do over things like the dynamics of global petroleum markets.
Secretary, as I'm sure you're well aware now, John Oliver teed up a lot of these problems last night on HBO, devoting the majority of his show to the devastating conditions that truck drivers face. He talked about the very things you just talked about, not just what they're paid, but how they're paid. And he also said the problem is a fundamental lack of value placed on their time. They're not getting benefits. They're paid by the mile. How do you, one, convince people to come into a field when there are 11 million open jobs in this country? And how do you convince these major companies to change the conditions and value their time?
Well, that's just the thing. Nobody pays for wasting a truck driver's time except the trucker themselves. Now, I should say, that's not true everywhere. You have some employers that do compensate their drivers for detention time, but a lot of others don't, and when you have these owner-operators, they're really exposed there. Look, I'm glad there is more of a spotlight coming on the important role that drivers play and the way that they're treated. We can take steps on our side too, like with all this infrastructure money we're rolling out, encouraging states to deploy it in ways that's going to make more parking available. It sounds like a convenience issue, and it is, but it's also a safety issue because of where these drivers are sometimes forced to park before they hit their limits on how long they can safely drive. And it's an economic issue because sometimes they have to end their trip earlier than they otherwise would, or risk not having a place to park when they do hit that limit that's there for safety reasons. So there's a lot of things we can do, and it starts just as a country with valuing these workers because, as the president said, if every truck driver tomorrow morning wasn't driving, everything in this country would grind to a halt. These are the definition of essential workers. We got to back them up, stand with them, make sure they are paid and treated like the very important workers that they are.
And so, Secretary Buttigieg, what level of spending do you believe will be necessary to implement infrastructural changes in order to transition trucking both towards clean energy solutions, also without diminishing transportation times and productivity?
Well, look, we've just put about $50 billion out just in the road funding alone, and quite a bit of that is eligible for things that will improve both throughput and potentially issues like parking. Of course, big picture, we got to have multimodal solutions too. We got to make sure if there's a shortage of trucks, for example, at a port, that we have more on-dock rail to allow containers to get directly from a ship to those railheads, or at least get there with fewer steps in between. We got to make sure the whole system is more resilient, that it's more efficient. We're making up for decades of disinvestment, but thanks to the president's bipartisan infrastructure law, we're now in a position to do so much more than we ever were about it, while also obviously taking a lot of steps on the energy side and across U.S. infrastructure.
And Secretary, we did know that the trucking convoy has left the D.C. area for now, and we know that even though they don't represent the entire industry, there was a lot of negative language. It took a nasty turn. Some truckers threatening to tar and feather Black Lives Matter Plaza in D.C. When you already have so many truck drivers retiring, you mentioned 300,000 a year. What needs to be done in terms of the messaging to make minorities and women who are underrepresented in this industry feel more welcome and really address the lack of diversity in the industry?
Well, first of all, I don't want a handful of people to be viewed as if they somehow speak for an industry, because the good name of the transportation trucking workforce is worth a whole lot more than a few extreme voices. But I do agree that this country and this industry, frankly, needs to do more to include and support women, to include and support drivers and workers of color. And that's one of the things we're working on through this task force. Matter of fact, we set up a whole body of experts that is just going to work on this issue of women in trucking and making sure that they're supported, making sure that they're safe, making sure that the way the training works and the way the parking and arrangements at stops works is going to help them and support them. Same thing for workers of color, because frankly, not only is this a matter of basic fairness and justice and the right thing to do, but just as a matter of economics, this country cannot afford to leave any talent on the table, whether we're talking about truck drivers or the construction workforce that's actually going to be needed to build all of this infrastructure that we're putting out there. We need to make sure that anybody who can contribute is welcomed into this career and supported once they do.
And speaking of the economy, the president touted a lot of numbers about the present economic conditions at your event today, including the recent jobs numbers, the 3.6% unemployment rate. How do you reconcile all those positive numbers with the fact that the president sits at 40%, his lowest to date, 33% on the economy? And what does that mean in terms of accomplishing the objectives you've mentioned to us if that holds through the midterms?
Well, the low unemployment that we're seeing right now and the millions of jobs that have been created under this president are extraordinary. They are of historic proportions, but nobody around here thinks that means the job is done. We know that we see issues around prices. It's why we're fighting inflation with everything we've got, including these supply chain measures. We know that people are still feeling so many effects from the pandemic and a lot of other things before anybody could take a sigh of relief and say everything's going along just fine. Add to that there's always a lot of politics around all this, and it's all the more reason for us to continue focusing on actually delivering results for Americans. I know that's what the president expects of the administration, of cabinet members like me, and we're going to keep pushing and keep getting results.
Secretary Buttigieg, as we get into the summer months, many families and households planning for air travel. It comes at a time, though, at least in this immediate term, that you're seeing either pilots' unions and some pilots go on strike. You're also seeing some of the relationships be tenuous between the airline operators and then additionally other staff, whether that be run by the airlines or whether that be other unions that they interface with, especially on the flight attendants front. And so with all of that in mind, at a time where we know it's going to be ramping up, I wonder what type of overlap you're similarly seeing between the Department of Transportation and the Department of Labor on the front of air travel right now.
Well, we're working closely with the U.S. aviation sector to make sure that their recovery from the worst days of the COVID pandemic is complete, and crucially, to support those workers who are also essential workers, who can't come to work on Zoom, who have been there throughout and been through extraordinary pressure and extraordinary uncertainty. We need to support them in a number of ways. As with trucking, it means making sure that they are paid and treated well, but also it means making sure that the flying public is supportive. We're pleased to see improvement, but it hasn't gone far enough in terms of ending the disruptive behavior that we've seen in our skies, and that's just one example of a source of pressure and strain on our flying workforce. It's unacceptable. It's got to change, and they need to know that they have the FAA at their back to make sure that anybody working in this field is supported.
And Secretary, I want to ask you about the new fuel industry standards. You said that it'll be a win for every driver in America, but a particularly big win for rural Americans. Until these, though, actually come into force, what kind of relief can rural Americans expect with inflation still so high?
Well, one of the reasons why this is true is that most rural Americans drive longer distances, which means they burn and buy more gas and diesel, which means that they will experience more relief from more efficient vehicles. That's part of what CAFE standards have delivered over the years. And as we get this new round in that's going to take us through model year 26, we could see average or typical efficiency go up to 49 miles a gallon. Compared to today's average efficiency, that could mean the difference, especially if you're driving long distances. As part of your daily routine or your trip to work. That could mean the difference between having to fill up 4 times a month or only having to fill up 3 times a month to cover the same distance. That is dollars and cents cash savings to American families. And again, those who drive the most typically are those who live in rural communities. So, at a time like this, when we're going through so much change and so much innovation in the auto industry, these standards are going to be very important. Obviously, they have an environmental role that's crucial, but also simply important for saving families money.